Welcome to Through the Bible with Pastor Michael, a podcast from First Baptist Church in Mustang, Oklahoma. Here's Pastor Michael.
All right, September, day 17. We continue on in our study through Job. We're in 3 chapters today, chapter 31, 32, and 33, along with our reading from Isaiah 6. Isaiah 6 is one of the real climactic chapters in the Old Testament, one of the most well-known chapters. Even if you don't know exactly where it's found, you most likely are very familiar with the words from Isaiah 6. Isaiah 6 is where we get the verse 3 that says, "Holy, holy, holy is Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." Also, other very familiar words. I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips. Very familiar words to us in talking about the holiness of God, the character of God, the worship of God as portrayed in the Old Testament. So very familiar there in Isaiah 6. But first, before we get there, Job 31, 32, and 33. First observation, Job defends his character. We read about that. And then secondly, he emphasizes his trustworthiness and his mercy that he has displayed to others. We get to see the insights of Job as he thinks of his own life and considers his own character, as he tries continually to wrestle with what he is facing and all the loss that he's had. Thirdly, we see this: Elihu speaks and has critique for Job and his friends. Elihu kind of stands in the middle, so to speak. If you've got Job over here and his friends over here, Elihu stands in the middle of them and has his critique for both sides. The fourth thing we see is Elihu tells Job to trust in the Lord in the midst of his suffering, in the midst of the unknown and the questions. He calls on him to trust the Lord. And then fifthly, Elihu speaks of how suffering can refine God's people. We've talked about that the last number of days. We've been walking through Job, that part of what happens as we go through suffering is there's a sanctifying process for us, a refining process for us. Sometimes there are things that we struggle with that we don't even know we struggle with, but they are revealed to us when life is hard. There are really two different ways that you find out what's really inside somebody. One is when they have days of loss, days of suffering, days of persecution, when it doesn't go their way, when they have great disappointment. That's one way we find out what's really inside someone's heart. The other way you find out is when someone has great success and great victories. Both of those things, great loss and great victory, great suffering and blessing, both of those can reveal what's really in our heart. And what Elihu says is that suffering can refine us, it can sanctify us, and we want to be careful to do that. So let's pick up on that as we look at our applications from our reading today. Number one, live a life that stands up to scrutiny. We want to live a life that when people look at us, whether we're having days of loss or days of victory, that when people evaluate how we handled disappointment or how we handled success, live a life that can withstand and stand up to scrutiny, not for the sake of people merely being impressed with us, but so that people would truly see Christ in us. When you think about Matthew 5, let your light so shine before men, it speaks of living our life in a way that our light shines. That means they're seeing things from us. That means that there is a certain character that's put on display. And let your light shine before men. In other words, people should notice who we are, how we live, what we stand for. But the end of that verse is very telling. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father. Glorify your Father in heaven. So we are to live a life that stands up to scrutiny in front of people, that's put on display, but in a way that isn't drawing all the attention to us, but instead is shining a light on the greatness and the glory of God. Second application: know when to defend the truth and when to not defend yourself. I was recently able to have a conversation with a very, very well-known pastor in America, and he was talking about a time when he had gone through a real time of turbulence in his own life, where he was getting lots of criticism from people, from within Christian circles. And he talked about how he did not feel compelled to defend himself. He described it as if you're in an airplane at 36,000 feet and there's all this turbulence. You want to pull the lever back and rise up to get to 38,000 feet, to where you get above that turbulence. And he talked about in a very, very difficult time in his life and ministry, just refusing to defend himself, right or wrong. Someone else can decide, but that he did not feel compelled to defend himself. And I think that one of the things that we want to understand from the book of Job is that we do want to be fierce defenders of the truth, but we need to know, do we need to defend ourselves or not? Defending the truth is one thing, but defending yourself may be something different. For me, in ministry, there are times you're criticized. That happens. That comes with it. And I think if you run around constantly trying to defend yourself, it's just exhausting. You can't win that. Somebody can always say something that's untrue about you. Somebody can always make up and exaggerate something. Somebody can always pass along something that's not factual. And if you go through your whole life trying to defend yourself against every single criticism somebody ever gives to you, you just can't put those fires out. So I do think we want to defend the truth. But as you defend the truth, let the Lord be your defense. There may be a time where you feel like you need to speak up. You need to defend yourself. But I think we want to pray for the wisdom to know, how do we live in such a way that we can defend the truth of the gospel, and yet when is it time that we should not worry about just defending ourselves and let the Lord be our defense. I think it was Charles Spurgeon who said something like, don't get too upset when you're blamed for something you didn't do, because you're worse than people even know. There may be things that people accuse you of that's not fair, not true, but there's also parts of your life and your heart that they don't know that's even worse than they would think. So let's know when to defend the truth, and also let's know when to not worry about defending ourselves. The third application: in your days of suffering, gather God-centered counselors. We want to gather people around us who love us, who love the Lord, who know His Word. We want God-centered counselors to speak into our life. We don't need to hear from people in our hardest days who don't know the Lord, who don't know the Word, who aren't centered on eternal things. We need to hear from people in our life that know the Bible, that trust Jesus, that can build our faith, that love us and can help us and grieve and mourn with us. But we need people that would push our attention upward to Christ. A fourth application: suffering has a sanctifying effect when we are trained by it. But just because you suffer doesn't mean you're going to learn. You've got to learn the lessons. You've got to have eyes to see what's being taught to you, a heart that's willing to understand and obey and follow the things of the Lord. But when we're trained by it, suffering has a great sanctifying effect on us. I think about the words of Hebrews 12, that no discipline seems pleasant at the time, rather painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. And so when we learn, when we grow, when we're willing to be trained by the things of God, It has a sanctifying effect on us. And then a fifth application, perseverance through trials builds character. It takes trials to build our character, but it takes persevering through those trials. And we have to have a heart that desires character and desires godliness and holiness. And then finally, a summary from Isaiah 6, a chapter really too rich and deep to try just to summarize. But here's what I would say of Isaiah 6. God is holy, yet makes a way for sinners to find atonement. Again, verse 3, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And yet, after Isaiah confesses that he's a sinner, a man of unclean lips, and that he lives among sinners, I live in the midst of a people of unclean lips, here's the good news. Verse 7, he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. The fact that God is perfectly holy would be enough to completely make us hopeless, if not for grace. It is only because God is gracious that we can have hope at all. And in grace, he has forgiven us of our sin, and we find atonement. And so we see that while God is holy, yet he made a way for sinners to find atonement through his grace. Ultimately, we know, personified in the death and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ.